Before trigger warnings, parental locks, and endless online outrage, executives aired stories about cults, stalkers, possessed children, nuclear panic, and domestic terror at prime time. Some felt less like entertainment and more like psychological warfare. Here are 25 of them. Trilogy of Terror, 1975. You simply cannot discuss the history of made-for-television horror without mentioning the legendary, nightmare-inducing Zuni fetish doll. Directed by Dan Curtis, this highly influential 1975 ABC anthology film's final segment, titled Amelia, features the brilliant Karen Black being relentlessly terrorized by a tiny, razor-toothed Aboriginal doll that violently and inexplicably comes to life. Armed with a miniature spear, the relentless doll chases her through her locked apartment, stabbing her ankles and throwing heavy kitchen knives with terrifying, unyielding precision. But it's the incredibly chilling ending that truly went way too far for network broadcast standards. After Amelia finally manages to destroy the doll by trapping it inside a hot oven, she emerges from the kitchen fundamentally and terrifyingly altered. In a horrific sequence that permanently haunted an entire generation of young children, she crouches on the floor wielding a massive butcher knife, her teeth now visibly filed into sharp points exactly like the doll's, calling out to her visiting mother in a guttural, demonic voice. The bleak implication that she has been entirely possessed and will now brutally murder her unsuspecting mother is a shockingly dark conclusion. It bypassed graphic gore entirely, relying instead on sheer psychological terror, claustrophobic cinematography, and a horrifying physical transformation that firmly embedded itself into the collective unconscious of 70s viewers forever, proving that television could be just as terrifying as any theatrical release. The Night Stalker, 1972. Before he was the iconic Kolchak in the beloved television series, Darren McGavin first hunted the undead in this groundbreaking 1972 ABC movie. What made this specific broadcast go way too far wasn't just the supernatural element, but how brutally real the violence felt for the era. The vampire, Janos Skorzeny, doesn't sparkle or brood seductively in a Gothic castle. He is a feral, monstrous predator lurking in modern-day Las Vegas who violently rips throats out. He leaves innocent female victims completely drained of blood in horrific, chaotic crime scenes that look like slaughterhouses. The local police are depicted as utterly helpless and incompetent, their standard-issue revolvers doing absolutely nothing against an unstoppable, supernatural force of nature that breaks through walls. The film aggressively pushed the strict boundaries of 1970s broadcast standards by showing the sheer, brutal aftermath of these vicious attacks, treating a mythical creature exactly like a graphic, real-world serial killer. It was so intensely frightening and phenomenally successful upon release that it actually temporarily derailed the scheduled airing of the ABC Monday night movie, proving that mainstream audiences were absolutely starving for unapologetic, visceral horror right in their own living rooms. The film's unflinching portrayal of civilian casualties and institutional failure permanently altered the landscape of television, showing networks that audiences would tune in droves to be genuinely terrified by a monster that felt terrifyingly real and completely unkillable. Don't Be Afraid of the Dark, 1973. This chilling television movie is the primary, undeniable reason an entire generation of people still sleep with their feet securely tucked under their heavy blankets. Kim Darby brilliantly plays a fragile, anxious young woman who moves into a gloomy, isolated Gothic mansion with her cold husband, only to discover that the estate's sealed-up fireplace is actually a secret gateway for a group of tiny, highly malicious demonic creatures. What aggressively pushed this specific TV movie into way too far territory is its suffocating atmosphere of complete helplessness and its relentlessly bleak, uncompromising ending. Unlike the vast majority of television produced in the early 70s, there is absolutely no last-minute rescue by the police or a heroic neighbor. The creatures systematically isolate Darby's character from the outside world, cleverly gaslighting her and making her appear completely insane to her skeptical husband and the oblivious hired household help. In the final, terrifying moments of the broadcast, they physically drag her screaming down into the dark abyss of the fireplace, and her husband simply returns home to find her mysteriously vanished. The monsters win entirely, showing a sympathetic, innocent protagonist being literally dragged to an underground hell with zero hope of rescue left was a staggering, controversial middle finger to the expected moralistic happy endings of network television. Gargoyles, 1972. Forget the sanitized, family-friendly Disney cartoon from the 90s. The 1972 CBS TV movie Gargoyles was a nightmarish, uncompromising descent into ancient, primordial terror that absolutely terrified unsuspecting viewers. Starring Cornell Wilde as a cynical paleontologist who stumbles upon a hidden colony of actual living gargoyles in the remote Nevada desert, the film went way too far with its incredible, grotesque practical effects, masterminded by a young Rick Baker and Stan Winston. The lead gargoyle, brilliantly played by Bernie Casey in full chilling prosthetics, wasn't just a mindless, rampaging monster. He was an articulate, highly intelligent being, harboring a deep, violent hatred for humanity's scientific arrogance. The film featured deeply disturbing scenes of the gargoyles ruthlessly raiding a human settlement, stealing fresh corpses, and engaging in shockingly brutal, bloody hand-to-hand combat with the panicked locals who are entirely outmatched. The sheer uncanny valley effect of the heavy rubber suits, combined with the genuinely unsettling, perverse plot point of the gargoyles desperately trying to repopulate their species by stealing innocent human infants, gave this specific broadcast a deeply uncomfortable, darkly erotic, biological horror vibe. It felt completely out of place on a peaceful Sunday night, leaving children utterly convinced that the stone monsters on their local churches were waiting for nightfall to descend. Bad Ronald, 1974. Sometimes the absolute scariest monsters hiding in the dark are entirely human, and the 1974 ABC movie Bad Ronald took the deeply unsettling concept of the creepy kid to unprecedented, deeply uncomfortable levels. When a highly socially awkward, severely disturbed teenager named Ronald accidentally kills a young neighborhood girl in a panicked, clumsy struggle, his wildly overbearing mother constructs a false wall in the main downstairs bathroom to hide him from the investigating police and the angry mob outside. When she suddenly and unexpectedly dies during a routine surgery, Ronald is left completely alone, trapped inside the secret, suffocating walls of his own home. What makes this film aggressively cross the line into way too far territory is the agonizing, palpable psychological deterioration of Ronald as he silently watches new, unsuspecting tenants move into his house. He begins creeping out through the hidden passageways at night, stealing food from their kitchen, and wearing bizarre, makeshift masks made of plaster and rags. The absolute terror of the film's climax, where the new family's young daughter finally realizes there is a feral, mentally broken man secretly living inside the walls with them, tapped into a deeply primal fear of home invasion. It made every creaking floorboard in suburban America sound like a psychotic killer waiting to violently strike. The Legend of Lizzie Borden, 1975. Television in the 70s was strictly not supposed to show graphic, bloody, brutal axe murders, but The Legend of Lizzie Borden gleefully ignored that puritanical rule. Starring Elizabeth Montgomery in a stunningly against-type, Emmy-nominated performance, this film didn't just recount the infamous historical murders, it visually reconstructed them in shocking, visceral, slow-motion detail that left audiences completely gasping. The masterful sound design alone, the heavy, wet thud of the falling axe, the sickening splintering of bone, the agonizingly slow pacing of the deadly strikes, went entirely too far for broadcast standards. Furthermore, the film aggressively pushed narrative boundaries by heavily implying, through surreal and erotically charged flashback sequences, that Lizzie was carrying out these brutal killings as a direct result of severe, repressed sexual abuse by her father. Merging graphic physical violence with complex, taboo psychological trauma was a jaw-dropping risk for ABC to broadcast in primetime. It refused to give the audience a clear-cut villain or hero, instead presenting a deeply fucked up, profoundly disturbing portrait of a woman shattering under the pressure of a repressed Victorian household. It resulted in a movie that felt more like an art house exploitation film than a standard television event, permanently scarring anyone who tuned in expecting a standard historical drama. Satan's Triangle, 1975. Kicking off a decade-long obsessive pop culture fascination with the Bermuda Triangle, this made-for-TV chiller, starring Kim Novak and Doug McClure, took the standard paranormal maritime trope and twisted it into deeply disturbing, mind-bending supernatural horror. A Coast Guard helicopter rescue team lands on a seemingly abandoned, drifting schooner, only to find a dead crew covered in strange symbols, a strange, bloody altar, and a beautiful, terrified woman hiding below deck. The film slowly unravels into a claustrophobic, disorienting nightmare of demonic possession, temporal distortion, and psychological manipulation. What pushed this broadcast over the edge of acceptability was its unbelievably bleak, deeply nihilistic twist ending. The rescuers aren't there to save Novak's character from danger. She is actually the literal devil in disguise, manipulating the crew's perceptions to steal their souls. The final scene, showing the heroic pilot realizing far too late that he is damned to an eternity of sailing the triangle as a rotting, tortured corpse while trapped in a time loop, is incredibly dark, serving up a literal, unambiguous deal with the devil scenario where the protagonist loses his soul forever, with absolutely no chance of redemption or escape, was a remarkably heavy, terrifying concept to drop on an unsuspecting Tuesday night audience looking for a simple, light-hearted adventure. Dying Room Only, 1973. If Bad Ronald made you terrified of your own house, Dying Room Only made you absolutely terrified of ever stopping for gas on a remote, dark highway. Starring Cloris Leachman and Ross Martin, this deeply unsettling thriller follows a couple whose car breaks down in the scorching, isolated desert. When the husband goes to find a public phone, he simply vanishes into thin air without a single trace. Leachman's character is left to navigate a bizarre, aggressively gaslighting psychological nightmare, where the local diner patrons, the shady mechanic, and the dismissive local police all automatically assume she is crazy and vehemently deny her husband ever existed. The horror here isn't supernatural or monster-based. It's the absolute, suffocating terror of systemic isolation, human trafficking, and small-town complicity in modern America. The film heavily implies that the husband has been kidnapped by a localized, highly organized, deeply sinister ring of murderers who prey on stranded motorists, and the entire rural community is actively in on the conspiracy. The complete lack of resolution. The viewer never finds out exactly what happens to him, and the police's terrifying complicity is left completely hanging, went way too far by violating the audience's basic expectation of safety, justice, and narrative closure in television storytelling. The Screaming Woman, 1972. Being buried alive is widely considered humanity's oldest, most visceral primal fear. And the 1972 classic, The Screaming Woman, weaponized this terrifying concept to absolutely devastating effect. Starring Hollywood Golden Age legend Olivia de Havilland, the film follows a wealthy, recovering woman who recently suffered a severe nervous breakdown. She begins hearing a faint, desperate, raspy voice calling for help from beneath the freshly dug soil of her sprawling estate's lawn. The sheer genius and absolute terror of the movie lie in the agonizing fact that nobody believes her. Because of her recent psychiatric history, her controlling, cold husband, the suspicious servants, and the dismissive local police all automatically assume she is suffering a severe mental relapse and hallucinating the entire ordeal. What went way too far was the psychological cruelty of this specific scenario, as de Havilland frantically digs in the dirt with her bare hands, desperate to save a dying life while being actively mocked, sedated, and institutionalized by the people closest to her. The audience is forcefully dragged into a state of agonizing frustration and helplessness. The terrifying realization that the person who buried the victim is actually someone living inside her very own home added a layer of domestic betrayal that felt utterly scandalous for 1972 television. Killdozer, 1974. Yes, you read that incredibly absurd title correctly. Killdozer is a legit, completely serious ABC television movie about a possessed bulldozer that goes on a brutal, unrelenting killing spree. And somehow, against all odds, it is completely terrifying to watch. Based on a respected Theodore Sturgeon novella, the plot involves a small construction crew on a remote island who accidentally unearth a glowing, ancient, pulsating meteorite. A malicious, highly intelligent alien entity inside the rock immediately transfers its consciousness into a massive, roaring Caterpillar D9 bulldozer. What makes this broadcast so memorably insane and boundary-pushing is how dead seriously it takes itself. The skilled filmmakers treat the construction vehicle with the exact same menacing, slow-motion, low-angle cinematography usually reserved for great white sharks or masked slasher villains. The sheer absurdity of watching grown, hardened men be relentlessly hunted, systematically crushed, and violently impaled by a piece of heavy construction machinery, and the genuine, palpable, suffocating tension it somehow creates, went entirely too far. It took a completely ludicrous, almost comical concept and executed it with such deadly, unyielding sincerity that kids across the country were legitimately traumatized and terrified of tractors, proving that network TV could make absolutely anything genuinely frightening. Where Have All the People Gone? 1974. Apocalyptic horror on network television was incredibly rare in the 70s, but this NBC film delivered a massive dose of existential, world-ending, soul-crushing dread that scarred anyone brave enough to watch it. Veteran actor Peter Graves stars as a man who survives a bizarre cosmic event where a massive, unexplained, deadly solar flare turns almost every human being on the face of the Earth into white, calcium-rich dust. The film deliberately avoids focusing on explosive action. Instead, it focuses on the bleak, suffocating, quiet, depressing reality of survival in a completely silent, empty, ruined world. What pushed this over the line of acceptability was the shocking, heartbreaking, deeply disturbing inclusion of animals. The solar flare didn't just affect humans. It inexplicably drove domestic dogs and wild animals into rabid, homicidal, bloodthirsty frenzies. Watching Peter Graves and his surviving family members be forced to brutally bludgeon packs of crazed, once-beloved pets to death with shovels just to stay alive was a shocking, visceral boundary push that felt deeply wrong. The film ends with absolutely no cure, no rescue, and no hope. Just a broken family walking into an uncertain, permanently altered, completely dead world, leaving viewers with a profound sense of hopelessness. The Spell, 1977. Riding the massive, highly successful coattails of Stephen King's The Spell took the lucrative trope of the telekinetic outcast and injected it with a heavy, ugly dose of vicious, unrelenting domestic abuse. Veteran actress Lee Grant stars as the overbearing, deeply manipulative, incredibly cold mother of an overweight, deeply unpopular, painfully shy teenage girl who miraculously, terrifyingly, discovers she has the destructive power to move objects with her mind. The film goes way too far in its unflinching, ugly portrayal of the mother's vicious, cruel psychological torture of her daughter, making the audience actively, enthusiastically root for the teenager to use her newly discovered powers to destroy her incredibly toxic, suffocating family. When the telekinesis finally manifests in full force, it is brutally destructive and completely merciless. The climax features incredibly graphic, shockingly bloody, visceral deaths by impalement and crushing, as the daughter completely loses control of her supernatural abilities in a fit of teenage rage. By blurring the moral lines between innocent victim and monstrous murderer, and punishing the parental figures in such violently unforgiving ways, the film offered a level of cathartic, bloody revenge that felt completely subversive, utterly scandalous, and totally inappropriate for a primetime network slot. Snow Beast, 1977. Jaws famously spawned 1,000 cheap, inferior cash grab ripoffs, but Snow Beast managed to carve out its own terrifying, highly memorable, unique niche by trapping its characters in a blinding white, freezing hellscape. Starring Bo Svensson and Yvette Mimieux, the film follows a massive, monstrous, savage Bigfoot-like creature that begins violently, brutally slaughtering skiers at a remote, bustling, isolated Colorado resort during a crowded winter festival. What made this movie aggressively, unapologetically cross the line was its relentless, suffocating tension and surprisingly graphic, shockingly bloody, visceral gore for a television broadcast. The Snow Beast doesn't just scare people away, it actively hunts them down, brutally ripping them apart and leaving bloody, mangled, unrecognizable, half-eaten corpses buried in the pristine white snow. The director's brilliant decision to set the entire final act at night, in the middle of a massive howling blizzard with zero visibility, meant the terrified audience could barely see the brutal attacks coming. The visceral, palpable, agonizing terror of being relentlessly hunted by an unknown, massive apex predator in an environment where you literally cannot see your hand in front of your face made this a surprisingly effective, nerve-shredding, highly influential broadcast that completely ruined winter vacations. The Bermuda Triangle, 1978. Directed by the notorious Rene Cardona Jr., a filmmaker well known for aggressively, shamelessly pushing the limits of cinematic taste and good sense. This TV movie is a surreal, nightmarish, utterly confusing, deeply disturbing fever dream. A typical, unsuspecting, foolish family sails into the infamous Cursed Triangle and immediately begins experiencing bizarre, horrifying, unexplainable, terrifying phenomena that defy all logic and scientific reasoning. What sets this specific film apart from standard, boring, predictable paranormal fare is its deeply unsettling, almost David Lynch-esque, deeply bizarre approach to supernatural horror. A mysterious, incredibly creepy, heavily weathered clown doll suddenly appears out of nowhere on the ship and radiates pure, undeniable, supernatural malice. The ship's compass spins wildly out of control, while ghostly, distorted voices echo endlessly over the static-filled radio. The film goes entirely too far when a survivor of a previous shipwreck is miraculously found floating in the ocean, completely feral, and violently, irreversibly driven mad by the unseen entities lurking in the triangle. It culminates in a shockingly downbeat, deeply depressing, utterly nihilistic ending, where the father barely escapes, but his innocent wife and young child are suddenly swallowed by the violent ocean, leaving him screaming into the dark void on a rescue helicopter. Devil Dog, The Hound of Hell, 1978. You think your loyal family pet is safe, loving, and protective? Devil Dog posited a far more sinister, deeply paranoid reality. Veteran actor Richard Crenna stars as a rational, sensible, highly educated man who foolishly brings home a beautiful, seemingly innocent, perfectly bred German Shepherd puppy, completely unaware that it is the literal, biological, physical spawn of Satan himself, sent to Earth to corrupt innocent souls. The film aggressively, shamelessly crosses a major moral line by taking something universally loved, trusted, and protected, a sweet family dog, and turning it into a ruthless, calculating instrument of pure, unadulterated, ancient evil. The dog doesn't just physically bite people. It uses demonic, glowing-eyed hypnotism to force innocent victims into fatal, gruesome accidents, or violently drive them to commit horrific, bloody suicide. The absolute, undisputed, jaw-dropping peak of the film's sheer audacity is when the satanic dog magically, supernaturally, impregnates a local female collie to birth a literal litter of ravenous hellhounds. Watching a cozy, normal suburban home be systematically infiltrated and violently corrupted by a demonic beast, culminating in a fiery, explosive confrontation in a dark cave filled with chanting cultists, was an absurdly dark, completely ridiculous, highly inappropriate premise that somehow got broadcast into family living rooms. The Initiation of Sarah, 1978, sorority horror, is a well-worn, highly profitable, incredibly cliché staple, but The Initiation of Sarah blended standard teenage drama with unexpectedly brutal, highly destructive, shockingly graphic supernatural vengeance that shocked unsuspecting viewers. The incredibly talented, underrated Kay Lenz plays Sarah, a painfully shy, deeply insecure, socially awkward telekinetic girl who is aggressively, forcefully pushed into joining a snobby sorority by her manipulative, wildly popular, and incredibly cruel, narcissistic older sister. The film's unflinching, ugly portrayal of vicious sorority hazing goes shockingly, unacceptably, deeply disturbingly far, depicting the popular, beautiful girls not just as mean girls, but as genuinely sadistic, sociopathic bullies who engage in severe, humiliating, deeply scarring psychological torture of the vulnerable outcasts. When Sarah is finally pushed completely over the edge of her sanity, her dormant psychic powers manifest in fiery, highly explosive, incredibly deadly ways. The spectacularly violent climax, set during a crowded, glamorous formal pool party, is a gloriously bloody, unapologetic, highly entertaining massacre. Sarah uses her immensely powerful mind to cause massive electrical explosions, mercilessly set people on fire, and literally boil the water in the swimming pool, effectively burning the cruel sorority sisters alive. The unapologetic, mass murder nature of Sarah's horrific revenge, framed almost as a triumphant, justified coming-of-age moment, was a wildly controversial, thrilling escalation for network TV. Cry Panic, 1974. The legendary John Forsythe stars in this deeply unsettling, highly underrated, completely forgotten, deeply underrated thriller that expertly, mercilessly preys on the darkest, most hidden fears of middle-class suburbanites. While casually, innocently driving his car through a quiet, seemingly peaceful, picturesque small town, Forsythe's character accidentally hits and tragically, violently kills a strange man with his vehicle. When he goes directly to the local, seemingly friendly, corrupt police station to report the fatal accident, he quickly discovers the town is actually a tightly knit, deeply paranoid, intensely secretive, deeply cult-like community that aggressively, violently refuses to acknowledge the dead man ever existed. The film goes way too far by leaning entirely, unapologetically, forcefully, into the visceral, palpable horror of blind conformity and violent mob mentality. Forsythe is relentlessly stalked, viciously gaslit, physically threatened, and violently intimidated by the hostile, menacing locals, who are desperately trying to cover up a much darker, far more sinister secret involving the murdered man. The tension is suffocating, unbearable, and deeply claustrophobic, agonizingly unbearable, because there is absolutely no supernatural escape hatch. It's just regular, ordinary people coldly, calculatedly deciding to destroy a complete stranger to protect their own dark secrets. The bleak, deeply cynical, utterly hopeless view of human nature made this a uniquely disturbing, highly effective watch. Dead of Night, 1977. This highly atmospheric, deeply weird, incredibly spooky ABC movie took the standard, tired, predictable zombie genre in a deeply unsettling, highly psychological, completely unexpected direction. Ed Begley Jr. stars as a man who tragically, unexpectedly dies on the operating table and is miraculously, controversially brought back to life, only to find himself inexplicably, dangerously, irresistibly drawn to a creepy, isolated, deeply unsettling mortician and a disturbing group of reanimated, silent corpses. What made this broadcast aggressively, shamelessly cross the line of good taste was its dreamlike, inescapable, suffocating, deeply oppressive dread. The zombies aren't the standard, mindless, flesh-eating, groaning shamblers of George Romero movies. They are eerily calm, highly articulate, unnervingly polite, and desperately, sadly trying to pull the living into their undead, purgatorial world. The film also features a terrifying, completely unrelated, highly bizarre subplot involving a demonic, highly sinister, ancient living chess automaton that physically moves on its own and radiates pure malice. The climax, where the traumatized protagonist suddenly realizes he actually died on the table and is now trapped forever in a hellish, nightmarish state with the ghouls, is a phenomenally bleak, devastating twist, showing a massive, unsuspecting television audience that hell isn't fire and brimstone, but an eternal, waking, numb state of existence, was a heavy, deeply upsetting, profoundly depressing burden. A Cold Night's Death, 1973. Long before John Carpenter's legendary. A brilliant, highly effective, completely overlooked masterclass in extreme claustrophobia, crushing isolation, and unbearable paranoia. Robert Culp and Eli Wallach star as two rival scientists, completely, utterly isolated, in a high-tech, heavily fortified, freezing Arctic research station, supposedly studying the intense psychological effects of extreme cold on monkeys. When their beloved colleague mysteriously, violently, brutally dies under highly suspicious, incredibly bizarre circumstances, they slowly begin to suspect that the test monkeys are highly intelligent, supernaturally possessed, maliciously cunning, and systematically picking them off one by one. The horror here is deeply psychological, highly intellectual, relying heavily on the crushing, inescapable, maddening isolation, and the slow, agonizing, highly realistic, terrifying breakdown of the men's sanity in the freezing dark. What went way too far was the film's brutal, completely unexpected, highly cynical, deeply shocking twist ending. It isn't the monkeys doing the killing at all. It's the supposedly dead, highly trusted colleague who actually faked his own death and is secretly hiding in the dark, narrow ventilation shafts, violently murdering them out of a deranged, obsessive, completely insane scientific compulsion. The final, terrifying, iconic shot, revealing the killer hiding silently in the shadows, right next to the surviving scientist, is a phenomenal, heart-stopping, legendary jump scare. The Cat Creature, 1973. Produced by the legendary horror director Curtis Harrington and brilliantly written by Robert Bloch, the iconic author of Psycho. The Cat Creature is a surprisingly erotic, highly stylish, surprisingly violent, deeply atmospheric homage to classic 1940s Universal monster movies. A young, naive, highly unsuspecting woman tragically, inexplicably, inherits an eerie, dark, heavily shadowed curio shop, inadvertently, foolishly awakening an ancient, deeply evil, highly dangerous Egyptian cult dedicated to the bloodthirsty, merciless, unforgiving cat goddess Bastet. The film aggressively, shamelessly pushed the strict, puritanical, archaic boundaries of 70s television, with its surprisingly sensual, highly predatory, deeply voyeuristic camera work, and its shockingly brutal, highly graphic, deeply disturbing strangulation murders. The titular cat creature itself is merely a man in a cheap, unconvincing feline mask, but the vicious, deadly attacks are cleverly, brilliantly staged, with such feral, lunging, sadistic, unrelenting intensity that the movie feels exactly like a gritty, terrifying, early proto-slasher film. Looking back, it's completely insane these ever made it to broadcast television. Today's sanitized, overly cautious streaming platforms would never dare air half the psychological damage these classic broadcasts inflicted. Did any of these movies permanently scar you as a kid, or did we miss the one that kept you awake for weeks? Drop your most traumatizing TV horror memory in the comments below. Hit subscribe for more deep dives into forgotten cinema. And remember, always keep the lights on tonight.